Today we have a treat for everyone. We have Adam White, who will speak about empirical design in reinforcement learning, mainly about good practices about doing empirical research in RL and the many pitfalls you can fall into. And what I also got from the paper was just thinking a bit more about what's the purpose of your research and encouraging more focused research questions in RL as opposed to more general, but that was my take. So Adam is an assistant professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Alberta. He also serves as the Canada CFAR AI Chair, the Director of the Alberta Machine Learning Institute, and the PI for the RL and AI Lab. Adam's research is focused on fundamental principles of learning both in simulated worlds and industrial control applications. He's deeply passionate about empirical practices and new methodologies to determine if RL algorithms are ready for deployment in the real world. So I think this is quite exciting because some people are also interested in RL applied to real world problems. And Adam has pioneered applications to RL to real world applications like real drinking and wastewater treatment plants. I'm not sure if we'll have time to go into that, but I think that's quite interesting. And he's also the co-founder of RL Core Technologies, a startup that is focused on applied AI and machine learning across industrial control. So thanks, Adam, for joining us. I will hand over to you.
Great. And so I can't actually see anyone just the way the presenter mode works on my computer. So if you want to ask questions, you just have to speak up and get my attention. But also I want to defer discussions because I'm going to raise a bunch of points that might be contentious, and I'd like to discuss those at the end. So just focus your questions if you want to interrupt me based on like, I don't understand what you're talking about and I won't understand the rest of the talk unless you clarify. Okay, with that housekeeping done, so I switched the title a little bit. The title of the talk was the title of our journal paper that was just published this fall in JMLR. But I wanted to use this title, Reinforcement Learning Experiments That Matter, and that's of course referring to a sequence or tradition of papers. So the first one being Machine Learning That Matters, which was an ICML debate a number of years ago, talking about experiments in machine learning at the time were very disconnected from reality, and people were focusing on small gains, and it didn't really matter. Later, Joel Pinot's group followed up with Deep Reinforcement Learning That Matters. So again, nodding back to the previous work, talking about problems with empirical practice in RL and specifically about reproducibility. And so we're kind of thinking of those things, and we're taking a step further, or maybe the updated version of this line of thought. And so I do work in reinforcement learning. We're not going to get into technical details in this talk in terms of like algorithms and update equations, but it's nice to just make sure we're all in the same setting. So it's a reinforcement learning setup. So I have an agent interacting with the environment, it's taking actions, and it's getting back observations and rewards. And I write observation because the idea of state in an MDP is very useful, and it's a great way to design things, but it's not the reality in almost any interesting application. And in fact, it's even a little bit different than that, because what we really have is a fairly small agent interacting with an absolutely massive environment. This is not the usual way we do reinforcement learning research. Typically, the agents are much, much larger than the environment. That's easy to see by just thinking about the number of parameters in DQN or Rainbow versus the size of the Atari emulator. And another easy way to see that this is the reality is that the real world contains a bunch of other agents, and those other agents might have just as complex a mind as the agent does. And if it were to try to perfectly model the world, it would have to model all those additional minds. And in fact, the agent itself is in the world. So it truly is the scenario where the world is very vast compared to the agent. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk, and you'll see where it comes back up. I wanted to just talk a little bit about goals. And so the intro was very nice because the intro talked about the paper making people question what their goals are in their research. And that's exactly what we want to do with this kind of discussion topic. So, there's theory work in reinforcement learning, of course, there's algorithm development work, but a lot of work in RL is driven by empirical validation. That's a common theme across many things. And when you do a reinforcement learning experiment, you could have many different goals. I've listed a few of them. I think these cover 90% of what people do. The first one is solve a simulator, and a good example of that is chip design. You know, you're literally looking for a chip design that's way better than anything else, and you want the outcome. You want, in some sense, you want the optimal policy as an artifact that you're going to use because it has some monetary or social value. In contrast, the optimal policy is not very interesting in Pong, and you know, no one's really interested in that. And in fact, we already have it, so why do we even care? You might be doing benchmarking to establish state of the art. That can be interesting as long as the benchmark is not stale. If the benchmark isolates some key unresolved challenges, it drives algorithmic innovation, then focusing on benchmarks is a really good thing because it just drags the field forward, almost kicking and screaming. That's what happened with the ALE benchmark, right? We went from grid worlds and mountain car and a couple other things to, you know, much larger problems almost overnight because the benchmark really pushed the algorithms in a different direction. There's the third camp, which I call the Sutton camp. It's, you know, understanding intelligence, mind, knowledge. You know, people who started being interested in how the human brain works and what is the meaning of intelligence, and using computer science as a lens to understand that question. And then finally, one that I've been kind of drifting more towards in my research program is deployment in the real world. And so there could be a 5 or a 6 that I haven't left off, but like I said, I think I'm comfortable in saying this is 90% of empirical work in RL. And no matter what of these 4 camps you fall into, you're going to be interested in comparing algorithms carefully because you don't want to mislead yourself. And so that kind of goes into the outline for today's talk. The outline being, there's going to be 2 parts to this. The first part is don't waste your time. I'm making this glib title, or this glib section title, because I really want to engage people. And so I'll start with a case study. I'll talk to you about a few things that I think are important coming out of that empirical design paper. So you need more runs than you think and better statistical tools. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about hyperparameters, the hyperparameter crisis in reinforcement learning, and how do you deal with hyperparameters when you don't have a simulator, i.e. when you're in the real world. So that's the plan for today. And let's get going. So I wanted to start off empirical work. Sometimes I use examples from animal learning. I'm using a new example here, but basically I wanted to kind of give an example of how empirical work looks like in other fields of science so that we can contrast it to what we do in reinforcement learning and computer science. And so there was this paper that came out in 2007. It was published in Science. And it was a pretty big deal. They were looking at how birth order affects or is related to IQ. And so birth order being like whether you're firstborn or secondborn. You know, if you're firstborn, are you smarter than if you're secondborn, or vice versa? And I like this example because there's many ways to mess this up. And so there's very obvious ones like small sample size, like you just grab 10 people from Norway and 10 people from Japan, and then you try to do the study. That'd be bad. Not controlling for development environment, not controlling for parental effort. Like, you know, when you have your first child, you might put a lot more effort into parenting than your later children. That's just a natural thing. Stress associated with second labor. There's you know, effects that happen inside the womb. All kinds of things you would want to control for. The interesting thing about this study, and maybe it's like contrast to what I'm going to talk about in reinforcement learning, is actually methodologically they did an amazing job. This study was done with over 200,000 people, and they controlled all of these things I've listed and many more. And so like that's the first way you can mess up science, is you don't control for the confounding things and you just have broken methodology. But this study had a different problem, one that we also have in reinforcement learning, which is, unfortunately, the results of this study weren't super exciting because the difference in IQ actually was only 3 points. And that's not a really big difference in an IQ test, let alone whether you think IQ tests are important or not. And so I wanted to kind of show the 2 sides of how you can mess up a study. This study made a lot of news, and then when people started pointing out the small effect, it kind of dropped in popularity. And my take-home message here is that we can't do science by rote. It's impossible for me to lay out a set of rules for you to follow and then go by that. And in fact, that's what causes all the problems. People want just a simple algorithm they can follow to do empirical work and then declare success. And that's not how it works when you're trying to control your methodology, and it's not how it works when you try to figure out whether your result really matters. And so you have to just think. But like, there's lots of hope here. Reinforced learning is way, way easier than the other sciences. Like, we literally construct the environment that the agent operates in. We design the experiment protocol. We can isolate sources of variation. Like, they have genetic differences in rats. And what do? Sometimes they just eliminate rats from the study. We can perfectly control those things. We get to instrument pretty much all aspects of things. The experiment protocol that's collecting data, information inside the agent, information inside the environment. It's amazing. We can instrument absolutely everything, and we can run all these things massively in parallel, and we can do it many, many times faster than real time, making new experiments all the time. Like this, we have all the tools to get this right. At the top, I said robotics is different, and robotics is different. That would be a whole different talk. I worked in that space. It's tough times. But yeah, all these things remain true, that we have lots of chances to do this really well. And in fact, we have lots of chances to do it much better than other fields can do it, just by the nature of our work being inside computers. And yet we see a lot of bad empirical practice. And to motivate this, I'm going to go through a quick case study. So my lab has worked on new actor-critic methods because we're interested in continuous action methods. And of course, one of the first things someone does when they start a project is they try to reproduce results from the literature because they want to get their implementation of something up and running. So that's what we tried to do. We tried to reproduce a policy gradient result. This was our reproduction. And so what you can see here is that I think this is half cheetah. We're looking at SAC and 2 variants of DDPG as baselines. And what I say at the bottom is the true thing. We tried to reproduce the result, and we did it by using way more runs than the original work because we wanted to be sure about the result. We did extensive hyperparameter sweeping to make sure that the hyperparameters we were using were at least as good as what was being used in the work. And we did all manipulations of the architecture and all kinds of implementation choices. And the problem is that for those who know the spinning up benchmark, this is a low number for SAC and half cheetah. It's quite low. And in fact, the other thing that's the big issue is that there's much more variance in this result. And we are trying to report exactly what they're reporting, which was the shaded region is min and max performance, which is a little bit of a strange choice for a shaded region, but that's what we try to do. And so we get much wider shaded regions and much worse performance, despite efforts to actually improve, not just reuse. And so we wanted to know why we failed. And so there was a lot of things that made it difficult to make this work. And so, this is what's reported to me in meetings with my frustrated students, but, the repository containing multiple wrappers, and it was unclear which implementation baselines were used. The repo had hyperparameters, but they didn't match the paper, and it was unclear which ones were being used. Especially for the baseline methods like DDPG. And there was all kinds of algorithmic components that were in the repo, but were not in the paper. And we know about this, right? Like, there's been good papers about how implementation details matter and that they're often go underreported in papers. And so here it tripped us up for sure. And so we kept digging. And so we started inspecting the individual runs of the system. And that's one of my first pieces of advice, is always, don't just look at the mean curve. Look at the individual runs, see what's going on. And we saw some were really, really good, reaching that peak level performance that we see in the reported benchmarks, and some were horrible, just completely failing. We also noticed that the repo included seed selection code. So literally run a set of seeds and then pick the best 5. Could be that was used. It could be that they just got lucky. You can also do accidental seed hunting, and we can talk about that later. So something interesting is happening there. And another undocumented choice, the code allowed to use in this initial expiration period, i.e. keep the policy random initially, collect 10,000 steps of experience, and then start learning from there. This is like the initial replay buffer size in a DQN-like architecture, but here it's just implemented as an expiration period. And so when we did those things, all of a sudden we're starting to get the performance we expected to see. So the blue line here is seed search. So literally running 30 seeds and then picking the best 5 and averaging over them. You get really good performance, tight shaded regions, of course. Or if you don't do seed search and you do this initial expiration period, then you get pretty similar performance, not quite as good, maybe as you might expect. The interesting thing here is SAC needs this for half cheetah, but it doesn't need it for all the Majoko domains. So for some domains, it's critical for performance, and others it isn't. So yeah, so that was a nice thing, and we got a big jump in performance. And then of course we have more variants of things, but yeah, we're showing our improvement in peak performance. The green line has a little bit wild shaded regions because you have some failing runs. That's a hallmark of some of your seeds just catastrophically fail. And we also want to improve the baseline because, you know, if we couldn't get the main method working, was the baseline also working properly? So we looked at hyperparameter sweep. We also looked at how the noise is being done, whether it's OU noise or other noise. And we also found a bug in how episodes were cut off. A lot of times when people cut off episodes in an RL experiment, they treat it as an episode termination, and that typically doesn't break learning, but it does sometimes cause issues. And so when we did that, changing the noise, changing the hyperparameters, all of a sudden we were able to pull the baseline, the yellow line, way up. And if you look at this plot, you might then decide that, okay, there's not this massive gap between these two methods. And inset here is the figure from the original paper. So SAC was in orange. The best DDPG baseline was in green. From that graph, you would definitely say SAC is absolutely trashing DDPG, and you'd never want to use DDGP in this domain. And here we're definitely getting a different result. And in fact, if you don't have that initial expiration period, as you can see, the red line is above the black line, which means DDPG is actually outperforming SAC. And so, yeah, this is just a little bit of a study in how hard it is to reproduce results and how gains could be made, both in understanding what are the important factors that weren't ever really discussed at length in the paper, which maybe become part of community wisdom, and maybe there's blog posts about it, but it should be in our scientific literature. And then, of course, how it's so easy to misrepresent baselines in an empirical study. So, you know, those kind of things trouble me. Those kind of things trouble other people. And some people might say, well, this is really hard. There's no real good guidance on how to do this. Well, my first reaction to this is, actually, if you read Sutton and Bartow, it's like a case study in good empirical design. They do really good experiments in there, and it's because they care deeply about it. But there's more than just that. You know, there's basically the Hitchhiker's Guide paper that's basically a crash course in how to do statistics in RL, and talks about type 1 and type 2 errors and how confidence intervals make different assumptions. There's Scott Jordan's work on how you deal with hyperparameters and reinforced learning. If you want to do it really fairly and really carefully, you end up randomly selecting them and comparing performance distributions. It's very, very expensive. I really like the Revisiting Rainbow paper because it's all about trying to draw good conclusions from small scale experiments, because if you have to run everything on a massive compute architecture, you'll almost be forced to do bad experiments. And then the Statistical Precipice paper was talking about how you aggregate performance across multiple environments, multiple Atari games. That was the motivation. People often use this within an environment, but if you talk to the authors of this paper, like Pablo, he'll tell you this was designed because Pong was really easy and Montezuma's Revenge is very hard. And so sometimes you want to drop them because they skew the statistics so much. So this was really designed for aggregating environments. So running good experiments is possible, but you really do have to care about wasting your own time. Like there's stuff in the literature you can read. You can read the RL textbook. You can read our journal paper to learn about these things, but you have to be razor focused on, I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to, it's not about publishing misleading results and how you could get made fun of for doing that. I guess that's a thing too. But way worse is that you spend a couple years of your life pursuing an algorithmic direction that turns out not to be real because the experiments led you in the wrong direction. Yeah, so that's the case study and the don't waste your time. Let's just look at some data and talk about the more runs thing, because it's often the most controversial thing. It's often the thing that causes fights in our reviewing system and debates on Twitter. And so let's look at this a little bit. So this talk contains a bunch of experiments just like the paper does, and we try to use a large number of different agent architectures and different environments to show that this isn't just, you know, one agent and environment that Adam found to make all his conclusions. So This is DQN on mountain car. This is a fairly standard DQN mountain car curve. DQN's not that great on mountain car, but we see performance is going up. Up is good here. We've got a fairly tight confidence bound, and this was produced over 200 runs, so lots and lots of runs. And so this is what this looks like. I'm a little unhappy with the dip, but it is what it is. And so, what does the data look like that produced this curve? Well, it looks like this, actually. So these are the individual runs that made up this average. And, it's true that that average is the average of these things, but it's clear that this average and this view of representing uncertainty is not very useful to us, because a lot of these agents are crashing for long periods of time and just doing really, really poorly. And I would argue that we're missing a lot if we're not looking at the individual runs here, and we're looking at this summary statistic. And this is a study I did a deep mine when I was investigating new off-policy algorithms. This is a TD-based algorithm on Barrett's counterexample, which is the famous counterexample that breaks TD. And this is just showing you the performance of all the seeds. And what we can see here is, on average, the performance is really, really good, but one of those seeds has a massive increase in error and it comes back down. Again, looking at the individual data to see the structure is very, very useful. This doesn't mean this algorithm is useless. And in fact, if your application or your setup, you're okay with the occasional bad performance, then this is fine. If you're controlling a water treatment plant, this might not be acceptable performance to you. But if we just look at the average curves, you'll just get a slight bump there from this outlier. But if I run enough seeds, this is a fairly rare phenomenon. I just won't see it. And it's actually way worse than you think. So Andy Patterson, who was a PhD student in the group, ran this really interesting experiment where he wanted to make the scenario where 10,000 labs ran the same RL experiment. And what they wanted to do is they had 4 algorithms. Those 4 algorithms had their hyperparameters fixed. They wanted to we want to rank those 4 algorithms using as few seeds as possible. So the question is, if you want to, use a set of seeds and then rank the algorithms and compute, confidence intervals around them such that those confidence intervals don't overlap, so that you could rank the 4 algorithms and be certain that the ranking was correct, how much data would you need to do this? And so we just did this on a toy problem, because of course this is outlandishly expensive. And the results were pretty shocking. So if you use 3 runs, and we look at a bunch of different toy problems, Acrobat, Carpole, Cliff World, Lunar Lander, Mountain Car, and Puddle World, you'll see that with 3 runs, you could convince yourself that you could get wrong rankings 47% of the time on Acrobat, 54% of the time on Cliff World, and Carpole's looking okay here, but the rest of them, that's quite a bit of chance of incorrect claims. If you extend it out to 10 runs, things drop, but still in Acrobat, we're looking at 31%. And if you go all the way, even to 100 runs, which, for almost all things we care about, that's a lot of runs, a lot of independent seeds, there's still some chance of misranking algorithms. And so this is actually, there's a lot of details to get this experiment and study right. So I point you to this cross-environment hyperparameter tuning benchmark that we published at RLC last year to get an idea of how this worked. So you can make incorrect rankings even if you're using 10 and 30 seeds, which is pretty surprising. So we can't follow standard practice here, because first of all, what is the standard? How is it defined? Who evaluated that standard? And a lot of times people use more seeds because they're worried about what the reviewers will tell them. Or they'll use a number of seeds based on what popular papers did. They're just following that practice. And that's not the answer. The answer is you have to understand what it means to have statistical significance. It means you have to understand what your data looks like so that you can use the proper tools, because we want to avoid misleading ourselves. Like I said, it's all about you working on the right thing. That's what really, really matters here. So what are those better statistical tools? Of course, there's tons of statistical tools. We outline a bunch of them in the journal paper. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here that I think are actionable right away. So, we've already talked about this 95% confidence interval shaded region is not a very good representation of the underlying data. We already looked at that. And when we do that, when you decide to construct a different statistical estimate and a notion of confidence, you're doing that you're typically making assumptions about the distribution of the underlying data. So often we want to do standard errors, and so we're going to make an assumption about known variance and a normal distribution. And so here's another experiment. This was compiled by Raksha. This is sarsalam with tile coding, so it's a linear agent on mountain cars. Linear agents with tile coding, we often think they're going to be really well behaved. And so if we want to do our standard error thing and we want to assume normality, okay, here's 3 runs. Is that a normal distribution? No idea. This is just a histogram of performance. Even if we have more runs, even the last one there, which I think is up to 20 or 30 runs, it's maybe that's symmetric. I'm not really sure. It's hard to argue that's a normal distribution. Even at 100 runs, it's still unclear. And then maybe afterwards at 1,000 runs, it's definitely a slightly skewed distribution. You wouldn't say it's a standard normal distribution. And this is actually more common you think. We were not looking for this example. We just literally ran it and then made the histogram of performance. And this is what it looked like. Close to normal, but considering this is like one of the most innocuous use cases, it was a little surprising. But we always have the data to look at this. When we're making our aggregate learning curves, we make them from this data. So it's always possible to look at this underlying data and decide what assumptions are valid with the data we have. Another example, carpool. Carpool is a really weird problem, and the performance in that case is multimodal. This is kernel density estimation to kind of smooth out that histogram. But basically, if you look at the mean's right in a valley, which means the real performance is likely to be balancing it for only 35 steps, and then less often balancing it for 250 steps. But the mean is at 125, and so we all know this. A mean is not very reflective of a multimodal distribution. And again, this is common. This happens all the time in problems, and you can make it happen even more often if you're using bad hyperparameter settings, or if you're doing things like cutting off episodes early. That really skews distributions. And so this is not cherry picking. These things come up, and our tools, the tools of assuming a normal distribution, don't handle this case well. Yeah, so like I said, these things come up all the time, and in fact, they change during the run of the experiment. And so this is the mountain car experiment, and this is just looking at the distribution performance as we're moving through the experiment. So we're just literally moving it through the learning curve, and it's going multimodal, it's shifting around, and this happens all throughout your turn. So depending on where you stop your experiment, you're going to get a different distribution. So it's not, these things happen all the time. So you have to check your assumptions, right? Like I said, confidence intervals reflect our confidence that the true performance is within some range, right? So we're plotting a mean learning curve with standard error shading. Given enough data, the confidence interval goes to 0. That's its job, right? Because we're quite confident, but that guarantee is only based on certain statistical assumptions. And like I said, known variance and particular distributions are very, very common. And so you just have to look at your data and say, am I matching the assumptions of the confidence interval I'm using? This is not surprising, but when we do science by rote, we don't think of these things. And there are so many other tools you could use, right? So there's student's T distribution, and there's bootstraps. So student T, we're basically just, there's the degrees of freedom in this distribution, which is based on the number of runs. So if you have many, or if you have very few runs, then it's not going to be very normal. And as the degrees of freedom approach infinity, becomes a normal distribution. So it's trying to account for this lack of runs. Bootstrap confidence interval in some sense is even better because you're building an empirical distribution out of the data through resampling. And so we've plotted that mountain car result with student T, with different hyperparameters and the bootstrap. And these are wider intervals, but they're better reflecting what's happening in the data. Now, of course, this is confidence. We want a statistical notion of confidence. There's other things that you can care about. And sorry, just this one last pass of, you can actually just be incorrect, right? So even if you're using bootstrap and student T and standard error, if you're only using 10 runs, you can actually miss the true mean, whereas the Berenstein one is making such weak assumptions. It's so broad, it's going to capture the true mean. And so it isn't until we get to 50 runs with even these more advanced tools like percentile bootstrap that we're we're starting to capture the mean. So this was DQN and Puddle World, but we can be confidently incorrect as it goes. But so the other tools I was thinking about is just characterizing the variability. So not the confidence, but just the variance in the underlying distribution. And it's the thing that you often see in the literature, people interchanging statistical tests, confidence intervals, reporting variance or standard deviation. These things are different things, but they're treated as interchangeable, and you're saying different things about your performance. So one nice tool is tolerance intervals. Basically, you're looking at the percentiles of your performance, and you add an uncertainty factor based on the number of runs. So if you have a few number of runs, you're going to basically drag this out wider. Otherwise, it's going to be based on the percentiles of performance, the 95th and then 5th percentile. And like I said, this is not the same as a confidence interval. This is really about the variance in your underlying data. And here again, we have our mountain car experiment. And what we're showing here is that the black line is the one we've been looking at all the time. And so the tolerance interval basically fills the entire graph. Like the performance could be all over the place, as we saw looking at the individual seeds. And then we included some other algorithm just to show you that even a tolerance interval, even a percentile-like thing, can have tighter shaded regions, even if you use these tools that are more reflecting the variability and trying to be more generous about your uncertainty. So you can get tighter tolerance intervals, just the gray ones are so broad because the black algorithm is terrible. And then, I usually talk to people with this either in person or in the reviewing process or at a conference, and they say, yeah, I understand everything you said, but do I really need more runs? And so then I usually have this conversation with them. So they tell me, come on, my agent environment is so huge, I have to run in the cloud. This requires so much compute, I can't add more runs. It's too expensive. And so what I do to these people is I literally say, okay, let's translate what you just said. I want to run an experiment that I don't have enough resources for. So let's just you and I pretend that this result means what I'm claiming it means. And here I'm talking about they're not using enough runs, and they're using standard things like standard error and declaring rankings amongst algorithms. That's the translation. Let's just pretend that this means what I want. Sometimes I translate this into, I was working on a theorem, I proved, several cases of the theorem, but one of them was too hard, and I don't have access to Chabas-Epesvari. So let's just pretend I proved that last case and the result goes through. We should just not accept this. And the solution is very, very easy. It's not burn down more trees or get access to more compute or submit more grants. It's ask questions that you have the data, the time, and the compute to answer. Ask different types of questions. And there are papers about this. Scott Jordan has another paper about scientific experimentation and asking scientific questions about attributes of algorithms rather than trying to do ranking, because ranking is very hard. So that's it for statistical tools, and it's really just a teaser to get you to read the paper because there's lots more stuff in there. But I wanted to just touch on hyperparameters, and then that'll lead into the last part of the talk, which is about the real world. So everything just gets worse with hyperparameters. We all hate hyperparameters. They're awful. The first thing is go back to the original case study, which is untuned baselines, misrepresenting the performance of other methods. It's often done accidentally. And the way it happens is so common. It's just so innocuous. You test your agent on some new environment, like you invented this new game, and you compare your agent. I'm color coding this because I'm going to show you a plot with DQN, because DQN is what everyone uses. It's a really solid general method, and you just use the hyperparameters for nature DQN because that's common practice too. And so you've got your brand new environment, your agent, and you show success. You do way better than DQN, and you're like, wow, this is great. I've totally got a new result here. There must be something really interesting in this agent, and I'm going to write a whole paper about it or a sequence of papers about it. But the problem here is that DQN is highly tuned for Atari, not like a little bit tuned. Like it's been fiddled with for 10 years to get peak performance in Atari by large groups of people with massive compute resources. And it's never been applied to GameX, so who knows if it has the right hyperparameters. DQN is not this panacea general agent, especially if you're using a fixed set of hyperparameters. Hyperparameters are IOU to algorithm design. We don't know how to make our methods fully general, so we give ourselves little knobs to tune them. And this is exactly what it looks like in practice. So you got your new algorithm in blue, you run it, it gets that level of performance in game X. You run nature DQN, it gets the black performance. And then all of a sudden you say, well, look at the blue and black. The curves are literally diverging. It's like the great empirical result. But then if you retune DQN for your new game, then you get performance that's either tying or actually slightly better. And this was a real experiment. We exactly did this. And so this is very, very common. It just sneaks up, and you have to always be on your guard for it. And so again, one of these kind of hypothetical or real conversations that I've had, you know, the common reaction is, but DQN works for everything, or nobody retunes agents anymore, or it's way too much compute. Similar kind of reactions to the previous one. But there's a really easy solution here, which is, especially in your initial work, just limit yourself to environments where DQN's hyperparameters have been tuned. If you're looking at DQN, look at, you know, Pong or something like that, or just a small number of environments, because otherwise you have to take up the burden of retuning DQN to not mislead yourself, to not waste your own time. So this is the end of the first part, and then the second part, which is a little bit shorter, is about hyperparameters in the real world. But just to kind of wrap things up, you need more runs than you think. Take the statistical point of view, just think. There's lots of things going on here. We have to think our way through them. Don't just follow a recipe. Don't just follow what people are doing. Untuned baselines are really tricky, so it's better to just avoid them, like I said. Don't fall into the appeal to authority fallacy. Just because you saw something in a highly cited paper does not make it okay. And think for yourself, prioritize understanding, not winning. We're here to generate insight and understanding, not win leaderboards of algorithms. That has very low scientific value, and we're all scientists here. So yeah, we wrote this cookbook. You've already been pointed to it, so I won't dwell here. Now I want to talk a little bit about hyperparameters and how bad they are, and how that affects the real world. So hyperparameters and reinforcement learning. This is an RL reading group, so there's all kinds of hyperparameters in reinforcement learning. You all know about them. But they're really, really bad. The performance of our agents is really critically dependent on setting key hyperparameters. So I think this is PPO, it could be SAC, but I'm pretty sure it's PPO. And one of my co-advised students, Jacob Atkins, ran this massive experiment on Machado, where he did huge hyperparameter sweeps, 200 runs each on PPO with 10 different ablations of PPO and all the hyperparameters for each one of them. And so you can just pick out one of these things. You can look at swimmer and half cheetah. If you try to tune for the best performance in half cheetah, you get that star mark right up there, which is like an outlier good performance. And then if you take that same hyperparameter setting and apply it to swimmer, you get not near the best performance there in swimmer. And this is expected and the usual thing. And so, of course, the default hypers of PPO are going to be somewhere else so that it can kind of balance the performance between these two things. But this really reflects, in some sense, the development path to the real world, which is you have access to either some subset of data or a simulator or just one instance of a problem. You try to make your agent work well in that. And by doing that process, you might make it worse for the deployment scenario you might care about. This has been getting worse over time. There's a newer version of this plot that shows a much steeper exponential curve. But basically, we're just looking at the number of hyperparameters that have been used in agents over the years. And Jacob just went through and counted them. This is not including network architecture parameters like activation functions or width or skip connections or anything like that. This is just inside the agent part of the learning setup. And you can draw this graph back to the late 80s. And so for 15 years, this graph was flat at 4 hyperparameters. It takes a jump up at 16 with DQN, and then it rises quickly up to 42 hyperparameters in Dreamer v3. So this is a real phenomenon. We're adding more and more of these hyperparameters because we want to tune them so that we can get better performance. And when you tune them, you're assuming a bunch of things. You're assuming full knowledge and access to the deployment setting, because to tune them, you're saying, I'm going to tune these knobs so that I get good performance in the place I want to deploy it in. You assume things won't break because bad hyperparameters can lead to really bad performance. Bad performance might have consequences, but we're assuming it doesn't. And then we're not counting the time that goes into tuning, either in terms of the compute or the human time, graduate student descent, as we all like to say. That's not reflected in our experiment pipelines at all. Like maybe we wouldn't think PPO was so great if we accounted for how much time it took for people to find the 37 tricks of PPO. And definitely 1 and 2 are true in simulators, and they're definitely not true in the real world. And so when you think about what to do about hyperparameters, you really have to consider what are your goals in research. And this is a common theme in this talk and in the paper, which is always think of your goals. Because you might have a goal of just prove your algorithm is state of the art, the best. I don't think this is a good goal. I think it's almost impossible to do, but it is a goal. You might want to understand how your algorithm's performance can change as you vary key hyperparameters. Think of the sensitivity plots you see in Sutton and Bartow about the effect of lambda and alpha in the Markov chain. You might want to deploy your agent in the wild, and so you really want to deal with how you set hyperparameters if you're going to do something like water treatment. And so for the last part of this, I'm just going to focus on this last goal because it reflects what I've been doing a lot of lately, and that's thinking about water treatment plants. This is the plant one of the first plants we worked with in Drayton Valley, Alberta. Water treatment is so straightforward, it can be described with an animated arrow. Basically, water comes in from the river, goes into that big mixing tank. We add chemicals into that tank to make the solids come together. They then pass through these 2 rectangular filter banks, which basically all the solids that are clumped together get stuck to the filter and only clean water goes through. If you want to wash those filters, you literally just run the process backwards and it blasts all the crap off the filters. This is kind of what the data looks like over the year. This is from a paper we published about this problem and open source the data so that everyone can play around with it. But basically, you see within the day variation, seasonal variation. You see times when they clean things. There's gaps in the data. It's really dynamic. It's really, really interesting. This is just 3 of the 120 sensors we have. And as an RL person, there's all kinds of interesting problems in here, right? So this big tank mixes really slowly. How much chemical do you put in it? When you do this backwashing thing of cleaning the filters, running the process backwards, do you aerate the filter while you do it? When do you do it? How long do you do it? All of these things were set when the plant commissioned, and they're not optimized. And in fact, the optimal values of these things change over time as the plant changes. Like, the pipes calcify and the filter membrane changes its permeability over time. So lots of opportunity for online in-deployment reinforcement learning. But we don't have a simulator of this plant. 1, because every water treatment plant is very, very different. So that would be a very expensive enterprise. And 2, we're working with a small municipality and they just can't afford to have someone build them a high fidelity simulator. So we want to learn in deployment. And so the way you do this, or one way we've proposed to do it, is what we call calibration models, which is basically every industrial control site in the world has logs of data. Like the PCL systems that run them log data. That's what they do. And it's data of operators controlling these plants reasonably well. So what you can do is you can take all that data and then just learn a model from it. So this is kind of the pipeline here. So you have your plant, you've got logs of data, you build a crude model of how that plant works from the data. And then you treat that like the environment itself, and then you do a hyperparameter sweep or Bayesian optimization, whatever you want to do, to find a good hyperparameter setting in this model. And then you deploy that and start learning again from scratch. So we're not transferring the learn policy, we're just transferring the hyperparameter setting that we found. And the idea is we're looking for hyperparameters that support learning in deployment, because it's too dangerous to transfer those policies because these models are not that great. And that's literally what we do. Instead of having an agent interact with the plant first, what we do is we first replace the plant with our learned model. And this turns out to work really, really well, actually. So we published about it in TMLR a couple years ago. We're working on some follow-up work now because there's lots of ways to build this model and make use of it. And does it work on a real system? Yeah, we actually took log data from the operators controlling the plant for a week with 480 different sensors. It also works with a year of data. The model of the plant that we built was actually a KNN model. There's good reasons for that. It's very stable under iteration, which is really important when you're rolling a model out very far into the future. And then you just treat the calibration model like the real world, try a bunch of different step size parameters, and then pick the one that performs the best, and then see how well it does on predicting the future of the time series. And so we just did this in a prediction agent, not in a control agent. It's hard to set up controlled experiments in a real plant. So these are the things you typically do first. So we just wanted to optimize the step size of Atom. And so if we look at the time series from the plant, this is membrane pressure. This is the pressure on the filter itself. So it gives you an idea of the health of the filter. This is what it looks like over time. And this is what the calibration model looked like. So this is being rolled out 34 minutes. So this is a multi-thousand step rollout. It's not exactly the same. It can't be, but it has roughly the same shape. And that's what you want for picking hyperparameters. Doesn't need to match the world, just kind of needs to mimic the dynamics of the world in relevant ways. And so I'm not going to show the results here due to lack of time, but basically we were able to pick a really good step size for Atom so that the future predictions were really, really good. And it was competitive with, just doing cross validation on the with holdout train and test split. But, again, we're thinking about using this for the control scenario where you just have some data to pick your hyperparameters for a control agent. And since then we've done that and it's worked very well also, but that's been done inside the company. So this is wrapping up. I guess I'm only leaving 10 minutes for questions, but can we do better than the calibration model for real world RL? Absolutely. It's a simple idea. It's very, very robust, but we can certainly go more in this direction. And in fact, we are. But we do need to stop assuming that, the assumptions we make in simulators that, you can't do damage, that hypertuning is free, all this other stuff is straightforward and easy. It's not in the real world. And more importantly, hyperparameters are a crutch that we've developed in simulators because they're so easy to deal with in simulators that we lost sight of the fact that we need algorithms with less hyperparameters, less sensitivity to those hyperparameters, and probably meta-learning strategies to just, make our agents parameter free. And of course, do any of those things to have things relevant for the real world, you need to run experiments that matter and that don't mislead yourself. Because when I was talking at the beginning of wasting your time and misleading yourself, this is what I mean. You can waste your time within the lab research such that when you get to a real world problem like this, you're in a scenario where the things you thought you knew based on 5 years of research don't matter at all for this plant, and now you have to do something totally different. So let's not waste our time. Let's do impactful research. That's everything I have, and this is the current group of RL research, or subset of them, of RL researchers at the University of Alberta right now. Thanks for listening, and we can do 10 minutes of questions.
Cool. Thanks so much for your excellent talk, Adam. I think you definitely inspired me and a lot of people to be a bit more goal-focused in RL research. And I really like the message of not wasting everyone's time, like not wasting your own time and also not wasting the community's time. So yeah, thanks so much for the talk. Because of limited time, I'm going to just prioritize questions. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand. Marcel, you've got a question, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. So I have two questions regarding comparison of algorithms. So one is regarding between IR algorithms. So I usually try to give it like a computational budget for a hyperparameter search to say, okay, you have like 1 hour or something to make it. But even that, I would ask myself, is this really fair? Because some algorithms have like less parameters like DQN, others have more, or I have maybe a better knowledge of the algorithm and therefore I have a smaller hyperparameter range. So yeah, this is one question. How do you recommend to handle this?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question, and you exactly touched on all the important things. The only other one I would add in is like designer bias. If you made a new algorithm and you are trying to run a fair experiment against baselines, your new algorithm has a huge advantage because you probably took 2 or 3 months getting it working and knowing all the ins and outs of it, and you ran thousands of experiments during that process. So it has a huge advantage, and you are personally interested in it winning. So then we have to fight that bias, right? I think actually just trying the things you already mentioned and discussing them in the paper is exactly the right thing to do, because we'll never get it perfect, but we just have to be clear about what we're doing. So my 2 go-tos are, I don't like tuning the baseline algorithm, so I try to find problems where people have reported. Ideally, the person who introduced that algorithm reported performance in some environment. So I'll use that environment because I'm basically comparing to my designer bias to their designer bias. The other thing is just, the goal in hyperparameter tuning can't be, I want to find the optimal hyperparameters. Like, we know that's literally impossible. And so what we want to do is be fair and be clear about what's been done. So we're trying to compare two good versions of algorithms, but this is a big space. Bayesian optimization is another way. Carefully accounting for the compute during the experiment is also a really good way to do it, but also really challenging. Like, there's no easy answers here.
Okay. And then I get to my second question. What happens when it comes to non-RL algorithms? So I am applying reinforcement learning in multi-agent pathfinding, and there are like, A-star, conflict-based search, and so on. And then also for me, the question comes in, okay, how can I make this fair? So one thing's again, okay, I give like the same computational time for some decisions, but the thing is, I can also do some tricks with these algorithms, and then they get better and better. And then again, the question is, okay, how much effort I put into this to get a better result or to make it fair? And this is also difficult for me to answer.
Yeah, I don't have a particular thing to tell you, but I do want to react to two things. One is this even using the word fair, I think is often misleading, and I think we maybe want to cast it out of our vocabulary, because it's not about being fair. It's about asking interesting questions and collecting evidence to answer the question that you can convince other people with. And so it's, who cares if the experiment is fair? If you ask a precise empirical question and then you present me evidence for which I'm like, yeah, you tried the relevant things, there's a high probability of your claim being true. It's all about claims matching evidence. And so this is what Scott Jordan's scientific testing paper is about, is like, let's ask questions about how the algorithms perform, what are their properties, what do they do? Ranking algorithms is kind of a race to the bottom. Like, when I think of putting multiple lines in a plot, I put lines in a plot because I want one line to be like, this is like ideal performance. If I gave the agent way more compute, if it's a different class of algorithm that exploits prior knowledge, that gives me a ceiling. My algorithm should never be able to cross that line. And correspondingly, and this is an example we use in the paper, including stupid baselines is also useful because it shows you where the floor is and helps you understand. Like, did a Hearts paper where we came up with a new Hearts algorithm for the card game of Hearts, and just putting in the random agent, like, is your agent actually better than playing that game randomly? Those are calibration baselines. But then once you get into the weeds of ranking A versus B, which I know our literature and our review system encourages, I think we need to do far less of that and far more of the asking precise questions about the properties of algorithms. That's my only answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do you have any other questions? In the meantime, I guess I'll ask a follow-up question. I guess like in RL, if you want to ask precise questions, sometimes it feels difficult with just the stochastic nature of a lot of environments and even algorithms themselves.
Yeah.
And then I know sometimes people create their own scenarios or toy settings. I'm not sure if you have any advice of trying to ask precise questions beyond these toy settings. Like, let's say now you have to use a more complicated environment, but it's difficult to isolate the precise question in that environment.
Yeah, so just to make it concrete, like what I mean about like a precise question about like the properties of an algorithm, let's say you're interested in exploration algorithms for reinforcement learning. So one very useful type of question, an experiment to run is your new exploration algorithm more effectively, or how is it exploring the MDP? We can do heat maps, we can try to characterize how much of the MDP it's touching. It's a secondary question of how well that performs. The claim was it explores better. You could say explores better for what, but the first level of performance is it actually visiting more of the MVP. In terms of that progression from toy problems upwards, I always follow the same kind of strategy. I was taught this by Rich Sutton. I really like it, which is you create a small instance of a problem and you try to use that to isolate an effect. So can you come up with a bandit problem or a small tabular MDP that really focuses on exploration, that you can run really good experiments and you can really understand things and control things really well? And then from there, I go to, okay, let's go to some of the benchmarks. let's do mountain car, let's do lunar lander, let's do an Atari game, to make sure that whatever I didn't fundamentally break things. So that's like a sanity check layer, because it's very possible that my exploration algorithm will not win on the benchmarks because the people overfit to the benchmarks. And then from there, I might actually then jump, and usually like the first paper is those two things. And then maybe the follow-up work is, okay, does this matter in a big problem of interest? Like whether it's water treatment or an important simulator or some problem where people aren't making a lot of traction on right now. So it's kind of a staged approach, kind of crawling up the difficulty mountain. And so at the end, you know, that experiment on Minecraft, you're not going to have statistical significance. You're not going to be able to control things very, very well. It's a demonstration type question. Does it even work? What can it do? That's the kind of evidence you can get in that scale. But at least it's sitting on the foundation of, hopefully I had a good idea that I explained was interesting. Those small scale experiments really isolated and said, okay, there exist problems for which it does what it wants, doesn't break on the classic benchmarks, and it does something interesting here. So we need to keep going in this direction.
Okay, cool, thanks. I guess, yeah, we have maybe 1 more minute, so time is running out. But I do recommend for everyone to please read through the whole paper. I learned a lot of things to do and things not to do. Cool. And thanks again, Adam, for your time. You do have to go in 1 minute.
Yeah,
right?
I have someone waiting outside my door.
Okay, cool, awesome. Thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.